Welcome to the SNN.Network Summer Virtual Event. We are pleased to introduce the next presenter for today's event, Greg Duncan, CEO of Virios Therapeutics. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, sir, and good morning all, and welcome to this morning's overview of Virios Therapeutics, traded as VIRI or VIRI, as we call ourselves on the Nasdaq exchange. Virios is a company that's focused on a very new scientific paradigm. We're a biotech company focused on exploring how the Herpes Simplex type 1 virus, a very common virus, can become activated and actually triggers the manifestation of chronic debilitating diseases, including fibromyalgia, which is a focus of our lead program. We will be making forward-looking statements today. If you would like additional information, you can either jump onto our website or check with all of the documentation we have filed with the SEC. Let me start this morning's presentation with an overview of the Virios Therapeutics proposition. We're a company focused on developing antiviral therapies, specifically antiviral therapies targeting the Herpes Simplex type 1 virus. And our lead program, as I mentioned, is targeting the market known as the fibromyalgia marketplace. This is a very large cohort of patients, something north of 200 million patients across the globe, and as a consequence has very significant commercial potential. That commercial potential is even further enhanced by the fact that the market is generally dissatisfied, largely due to poor tolerability of the existing medications that are available for docs and patients to treat patients with this particular diagnosis. Our unique combination antiviral therapy is an oral medication which combines two existing therapies, famciclovir and celecoxib, at proprietary doses, and this thesis of antiviral therapy to affect positive outcomes for fibromyalgia patients is actually supported by clinical data. We've gleaned data in a phase 2A trial which shows that IMC-1, this lead compound, has shown significant pain reduction and tolerability benefits in a phase 2A trial. So effectively, we've established to date a proof of concept for our lead asset in treating these particular patients. And I mentioned this is a novel approach, and while I think it's novel as a CEO of the company, and you would expect me to do so, you're probably more impressed to know that the FDA believes this is quite a novel approach as well, having granted our lead compound, oral IMC-1, the very first ever fast-track review designation for fibromyalgia treatment. And I'm pleased to tell you that between myself, the additional members of the team, and our board of directors, we have led the development and commercialization of a number of household medications, but importantly, have actually shepherded specific responsibility for 2 of the 3 FDA-approved fibromyalgia medicines. So a large market, a unique approach supported by data, and a team that's run this race before. And let me introduce you to the team on slide number 4. In addition to myself, we have Dr. Mike Genro, Angela Walsh, and Ralph Grosswald, industry veterans, small cap, large cap, private and public entity experience across the board. Dr. Genro in particular has extensive experience in the fibromyalgia vertical. He actually launched a drug called Savella, developed and launched Savella, one of the 3 approved drugs during his tenure at Cypress Biosciences. In addition, Mike actually served as a consultant to the Food and Drug Administration to scope out the process that was used to approve Cymbalta, Lyrica, and Savella, and is used largely intact to date to approve new medications in the space. So extensive experience from our chief medical officer and exactly what's required to get a drug across the goal line, if you will, for a fibromyalgia treatment. Our board, you can see on the right-hand side of slide number 4, is made up of virologists. Doctors Whitley and Della Rosa are virologists that have developed category-leading drugs. And Dr. Whitley is somebody that may be familiar to you. He actually chairs the Data Safety Monitoring Board for all of the drugs in Operation Warp Speed, which is obviously a very important position for all of the people in the U.S. and across the globe for that matter. And Rick Birch actually launched Lyrica for the treatment of fibromyalgia for Pfizer at the time during his tenure there. So between our team, the board of directors, we've really got deep well of experience in developing new drugs and specifically drugs for this particular condition. Let's talk about the condition a little bit. Slide number 5 highlights fibromyalgia as a disease. This is a chronic disease affecting up to 8% of the U.S. population. Hallmark characteristics are widespread chronic pain and very severe fatigue. And when pain and fatigue are persistent for 3 or more months, we land on the diagnosis of exclusion known as fibromyalgia. Other symptoms include gastrointestinal issues, sleep disorder, mood disorder, and headache. As you can imagine, this has a devastating impact on patients. It may surprise you to know that patients with fibromyalgia have a 3 times greater risk of committing suicide versus the general population. And estimates vary. but essentially we see estimates as high as 40% of these patients are actually treated with opioids, which is a bad fact for any disease, particularly for fibromyalgia patients who need to be on chronic medication. Hence, these patients have very high addiction potential. I mentioned earlier this is a large market, but I believe this market is actually poised for growth if a better therapeutic option emerges, and we hope IMC-1 is that option. You can see on the left-hand side of slide number 6 that there are roughly 10 million people who meet the diagnostic criteria for a fibromyalgia diagnosis here in the U.S. About a third of those patients are presently diagnosed. It takes some time to get to this diagnosis given the broad milieu of symptoms. And about 20% of those patients, or 2 million unique patients in the U.S., are actually treated for the fibromyalgia. This is a condition that's prevalent across the globe. Those prevalence rates range from 3 to 6% of the population, which equates to something north of 200 million patients at the low end of the spectrum. I mentioned before that this is a dissatisfied marketplace, and you can see on slide number 7 that polypharmacy, or utilization of multiple medications, and heavy utilization of unapproved therapies are the normative treatment standards for these patients. This is a very unusual marketplace in that regard. Of those 2 million patients I referenced earlier, those patients are on 2.6 prescriptions per patient, which tells you there's no single foundational therapy that's getting the job done for the vast majority of patients. You'll also note from the pie chart on the left-hand side of slide number 7 that 75% of all of the prescriptions, all of the medicines prescribed for these patients, are for drugs that are not actually approved by the FDA to treat this condition. And while that's not illegal, it certainly highlights that Cymbalta, Lyrica, and Savella, the 3 approved drugs, are not getting the job done for the vast majority of patients. The category leaders, Cymbalta and Lyrica, have a roughly 25% share of those 2 million treated patients. So think on average about 500,000 patients are either prescribed Cymbalta and or Lyrica to treat their fibromyalgia. And you can see that only 15% of fibromyalgia treatment prescribers, these are the docs that are writing prescriptions for these patients, are satisfied with their available treatments. To give you a sense of the potential value for our new safe and effective fibromyalgia medications, I draw your attention to the facts on slide number 8. Fortune Business Insights reports that the fibromyalgia marketplace in 2019 was about $1.9 billion US, so a $1 billion opportunity times 2. We believe the fibromyalgia marketplace has an estimated 5 times greater potential than the currently 2 million patients. There's 2 million patients that are treated, as I referenced before, but the epidemiologic estimates suggest that there's 10 million at least of those patients in the U.S. If you simply multiply the Lyrica estimated price per day of $16 a day and even took a 40% haircut for a 60% compliance rate because Lyrica, Cymbalta, Savella are not well tolerated, you'll note that we would estimate Lyrica sales and Cymbalta sales, for that matter, to be something north of $1 billion each for this particular indication just in the U.S. marketplace. So very significant potential, I hope you will agree. Mechanistically, our founder, Dr. William Pridgeon, actually implicated dormant herpes simplex 1, a very common virus. I believe it's actually the most common virus that affects adults across the globe, actually can become activated and triggers an abnormal immune response. And that abnormal immune response and the infection due to the activated virus leads to the pain and fatigue, we believe, that is the hallmark of this particular disease. The model really begins with HSV1 lying dormant in the neural ganglia, some type of stressor. It could be a health challenge, anxiety related to loss of employment in the COVID era. There's a whole number of things that can actually stress the virus. Those stressors actually activate the virus from a dormant state to an activated state. The virus, in a very Darwinian way, actually creates more copies of itself using DNA polymerase and viral genome. And what's less well known but quite well documented in the medical literature is that herpes simplex type 1 virus actually uses a very common prostaglandin, cyclooxygenase 2, or COX-2 as I'll refer to it, and to a lesser extent COX-1, to maximize its own replication. Essentially, think of cyclooxygenase 2 as a turbo booster for viral replication. It may surprise you to know that on the low end of the range, the World Health Organization estimates that 3.7 billion people across the globe under the age of 50 are presently infected with the virus. Estimates of more recent vintage using PCR testing suggest that even more than 67% of adults are infected with this virus. So it is very common, and we believe holds the key to a number of different chronic debilitating diseases, most notably fibromyalgia. The unique approach of our founder, and the one we've now got data on and are exploring further on our phase 2b trial, combines in a synergistic way famciclovir, which is an antiviral which inhibits DNA polymerase, so it inhibits the actual virus itself, and combines in proprietary doses it with celecoxib, a COX-2 inhibitor, which binds to the COX-2 pocket, thereby leaving less cyclooxygenase 2 available for the virus to use to maximize its own replication. This allows the immune system to reset, and then we see the resultant reduction in pain and fatigue in clinical trials to date. We have a unique IMC1 composition of matter patent that extends to 2033, and this is a synergy patent. So we're really excited about this particular thesis and the novelty of this approach. This approach is actually supported by biopsy data. I won't belabor the data on slide number 11, but suffice it to say that we actually have data supporting that there's activated herpes simplex 1 type infection in patients with fibromyalgia and a chronic GI disorder when compared with patients who have neither fibromyalgia nor a chronic GI disorder. So the thesis is actually corroborated by biopsy data, which was presented at the Digestive Disease Week annual meeting this year. Let's get to the data, because ultimately that's the real test of our thesis. On slide number 12, you'll note that the broad outline of our phase 2A clinical trial, our proof of concept trial, which has been completed, randomized patients one-to-one to IMC1 or placebo roughly evenly. These are fibromyalgia patients aged 18 to 70 who were assessed at baseline, week 6, week 12, and week 16, as you can see on the graphic on the bottom of slide number 12. These patients were assessed based on their pain using the endpoint the FDA uses to approve new therapies, as well as assessments of global improvement, fibromyalgia-specific domains, and then different pain threshold or analyses. So I'm really what I would describe as classic, down the middle of the fairway, phase 2A clinical proof of concept trial design. I'm pleased to tell you that we have demonstrated that IMC1 showed statistically significant reductions in pain on 2 key primary endpoint measures, including the endpoint, the NRS 24-hour recall endpoint that FDA uses to approve all new therapies in this particular space. Specifically, on the left-hand side of slide number 13, you can see that there's a 1.9 unit pain reduction for patients treated with IMC1 versus patients treated with placebo. You can see an even greater effect on the FIQR 7-day recall. And why is this important? Because essentially, as I mentioned, these are the outcomes that FDA looks at to approve new therapies. And specifically dialing into the 24-hour recall scale, you'll note that the 0.8 unit difference between IMC1 and placebo represents roughly double the difference seen in the Savella phase 2 and phase 3 trials. So while this is not a head-to-head trial, very encouraging results relative to the magnitude of the pain response, again, on the FDA endpoint that matters. You can see on the right-hand side of slide number 13, you see some improvement at week 6, statistically significant improvement on week 12, and then highly statistically significant improvement at week 16. And we believe this actually corroborates the thesis, because this is a drug that over time inhibits a virus and gets the virus back into a dormant state. That doesn't happen overnight like an opioid, where the pain reduction is immediate, but not necessarily targeting a potential root cause. We believe this actually supports the thesis that HSV1 activation is a root cause, and when you use the drug over time, we can actually get that virus back into dormancy. So we're really excited about the efficacy data that supports our thesis. Mike General, our Chief Medical Officer, would tell you he's most excited about the tolerability profile of this particular therapy. In addition to the excellent efficacy we saw on the primary endpoints, you can see reductions in fatigue, improvements in global impression of change, that's a global health measure. And then you can also see on the right-hand side of slide number 14, statistically significant reductions in anxiety, depression, improvements in sleep quality, and reductions in pain stiffness, other important symptoms of this particular disease. The adverse event data I mentioned, you can see on slide number 15. And at a very top-line level, just to give you the upshot of the data, we actually demonstrated for the first time, to the best of our knowledge, that IMC1 had a lower discontinuation rate due to adverse events than even placebo in the fibromyalgia phase 2A trial. If you can see the first row on this chart, you'll see highly statistically significant reductions in dropout due to adverse events on IMC1 versus placebo. In fact, patients on placebo dropped out at a 3 times greater rate than those on active treatment. That's the first time we have ever seen that. What you see in most of the trials that precede this trial, including in the data for the Lyrica, Cymbalta, and Savella package inserts, is a doubling of the adverse event dropout rate on active treatment versus placebo. We've seen the opposite here. And that becomes a real game changer because, as I mentioned before, this is a dissatisfied marketplace. The market is primarily dissatisfied because of the adverse event profile of the 3 CNS-mediated approved drugs. And so if we have a drug that actually works on both the primary endpoint of pain reduction and a broad milieu of symptoms, but importantly, given this is a chronic disease, we're not curing this disease, patients will be on it for the long term, having a well-tolerated drug is a real potential game changer. And as I mentioned, we're testing that thesis at present in our ongoing enrolling phase 2B trial. And speaking of that trial, you'll see on the next slide the trial design that we have agreed with FDA to assess IMC-1's potential as we move into further development. In this particular trial, we're using further optimized doses of IMC-1. These are using, in particular, antiviral or famciclovir doses that are higher than the approved drugs to date, and a custom dose of celecoxib to both inhibit the virus itself and also inhibit cyclooxygenase 2 and exert the same effect. And this particular trial will be using the very same endpoints that we used in the phase 2A, so good concordance between phase 2 and phase 2B, and we'll be assessing all of the other key secondary endpoints I just shared with you on fatigue, sleep, global health status, and patient functionality. This will be a quite a bit larger trial. We'll be enrolling patients aged 18 to 65. The sample size in this trial is not 230 patients, but 460 patients, roughly 3 times larger, with 230 patients randomized to either IMC-1 or placebo using those optimized doses, and we'll be assessing pain and other endpoints on a daily basis. We're presently enrolling the trial. We have something north of 40 sites actively recruiting patients at present, and we expect to complete enrollment by the end of this year or early 2022, with phase 2B top-line results in the middle of 2022. That's important because we have cash runway to get us to at least the end of 2022, so the plan would be to harvest these data and then get down to FDA and scope out the phase 3. And while we're speaking about phase 3, you should note that this phase 2B trial, albeit phase 2B in name, has really been designed in complete concordance with the criteria you use for a phase 3 trial. So the same entry criteria, the endpoints, the duration of therapy, inclusion-exclusion criteria that you would see in a phase 3 trial are what we use to design this particular trial in concordance with FDA. We have their blessing to progress this, and the case we will make, although I can't guarantee it at this point, is that if this trial is successful like the phase 2A trial, that this should serve as a significant part of our registration package and hopefully can gain agreement with FDA that only one phase 3 program is required. And again, we have time and money to get us through that dialogue with FDA, and then we can choose the best option available to us to progress to phase 3. A little bit about the other potential opportunities for this particular mechanism. As I mentioned, our founder really implicated HSV-1 as a common virus that, when activated, can trigger an infection with the virus and an overheated immune response. And while I've already showed you the fibromyalgia data, our founder actually has treated in an open-label way a significant number of patients with irritable bowel syndrome who have shown outstanding results when using this particular therapeutic combination. I mentioned earlier that we have GI biopsy, which confirms activated HSV-1 virus in patients with IBS. And you'll note that the Rome-4 criteria are now placing a greater emphasis on pain as the key endpoint for these patients with irritable bowel syndrome. And so we are actively working with Dr. Michael Camilleri at the Mayo Clinic to design a trial to assess IMC-1's potential in irritable bowel syndrome as a complement to fibromyalgia. And we're also discussing different fatigue-related syndromes, which are well documented as being virally catalyzed as triggers, chronic fatigue syndrome. And interesting, you'll note that the COVID long hauler group, which is now getting increasing emphasis, actually shows that fatigue is their most common symptom. And so we may have an opportunity to explore fatigue syndromes both within and outside of the COVID long hauler group as additional pipeline opportunities. A little bit about the cap table. As of June 30th, Virios has 8.3 million common shares outstanding. When you roll in underwriters warrants, which are exercisable at $12.50 a share, and then stock options for employees, directors, et cetera, we have 9.5 million shares on a fully diluted basis, and management ownership is about 20%. So it gives you a sense of the cap table for Virios Therapeutics. As I mentioned, we have runway to get to the end of 2022. That allows us 6 months to scope out the phase 3 program and decide whether or not we want to go alone or explore partnership. I mentioned earlier in the presentation there's very significant commercial potential for this asset. We do know that other potential life science entities have already expressed some interest in this, obviously pending our phase 2B trial results. And so we can decide at that point, what's the right way forward? Do we raise additional capital and run the phase 3 as a standalone entity? do we consider some form of business development or other transaction that will allow us to maximize both shareholder value and the commercial potential of IMC-1. And let me summarize on slide number 19 with where I started. If you remember nothing else about the Virios presentation, hopefully you'll walk away with these 3 key points. The fibromyalgia marketplace is a very large market, but unfortunately very dissatisfied. We believe this highlights the significant commercial potential for a differentiated new fibromyalgia treatment, and there's very encouraging results to support IMC-1 as that potential new therapy. This combination antiviral therapy uses 2 existing therapies, famciclovir and celecoxib, in customized doses, and is already supported by pain reduction benefits and tolerability benefits, which I just shared with you in our phase 2A trial. And recall, we're using the same endpoints in the phase 2B trial that we used in the phase 2A trial. And as an example of the excitement for this particular category, FDA has granted us what we believe is the very first ever fast track review designation for a fibromyalgia drug candidate. And as I mentioned, between the team and the board of directors, we've actually led the development of many category-leading medicines. Zoloft was my first launch. I'm sure it's a drug that's well known to you. There's a number of different blockbuster medicines that we've had the great potential to be involved in. And importantly, between Dr. Genro, the board, myself, we've been involved in the development and commercialization of 2 of the 3 FDA-approved drugs to date. So we're really excited about IMC-1's potential, and we hope you are as well. So that concludes my opening remarks. We'd be happy to take questions at this point. All right, first question we have here, what are some of the value catalysts for the rest of 2021 and going into 2022? Really great question. So I'll start with fibromyalgia. We had some key milestones in 2021 and in 2022 that we believe will portend increasing value for the entity. We'll expect to hit some operational milestones. This is the 50% enrollment by the end of Q3, early Q4, and then we expect full enrollment as we turn our attention to the end of this year and beginning of 2022. And while 50% enrollment and 100% enrollment may seem like, okay, well, that's not such a great thing, remember, continuing to enroll to full enrollment continues to corroborate the potential safety of any development candidate, right? You are assessing safety along the way for a particular trial, and by having those milestones, you're continuing to corroborate that the drug is well tolerated enough to continue development. Most importantly, we have the top-line results in middle of 2022, so less than a year away. We'll have something that could be truly game-changing for both patients and Virios Therapeutics shareholders. In addition, as we've communicated, we have an IBS collaboration with Dr. Michael Camilleri at the Mayo Clinic. We have now agreed a phase 2A trial design, and we're working to get additional feedback from experts, and regulatory authorities to scope out exactly what that trial will look like and hope to read that out in the second half of this year as a complement to the fibromyalgia trial. I should mention, if we do execute a second trial in irritable bowel syndrome, that will require fresh proceeds. In addition, however, we're looking at fatigue-related syndromes, and specifically fatigue that's associated with other diseases. An example I referenced before, but maybe to elucidate further on, is the COVID long hauler group. That's a group that is becoming better well known to most of the people around the globe. These are patients whose symptoms persist for 3, 6, 9, maybe even 12 months after their initial diagnosis of COVID. And while the general COVID settles down, they do have symptoms that persist, things like breathing problems, fatigue, brain fog that you hear. And you might be interested to note that fatigue and brain fog are 2 of the most common symptoms. And the thesis of recent vintage, which we're really excited about, where the science is really going, is that it may not actually be the coronavirus that's causing the fatigue, the brain fog that's associated with COVID. It may be the other common viruses which are infecting a patient. And when you add COVID or stack another virus on top of those diseases, that the immune system becomes extraordinarily stressed, and that those other viruses are becoming activated as the immune system tries to deal with the coronavirus, the herpes, the Epstein-Barr, what have you. And as a consequence, we're seeing breakthrough of those symptoms that may not be specifically noted with the coronavirus. And we've seen evidence in the prior SARS pandemic, not as widespread as the COVID-19 pandemic, but we did see very high levels of fibromyalgia, IBS, and chronic fatigue in countries where the original SARS virus was actually quite pervasive. And so we're exploring the potential for IMC-1 in treating fatigue that's associated with this particular long hauler group. Both IBS and fatigue-related syndromes are outcomes we will report back in the second half as we communicated during our Q2 update just last week. So we're really excited about those potential opportunities for IMC-1 and or other drugs in our pipeline. And we're looking to continue to build our intellectual property protection estate and hope to have updates about that over the course of the next 2 or 3 months. Hopefully that answers your question, Robert. Question number 2, seems like competing drugs currently available have huge advertising budgets. How do you compete with these expensive marketing campaigns? This is a good question. So, in fact, of the 3 approved drugs, Cymbalta and Lyrica are now off patent, and Savella is at the end of its life cycle and not actively promoted. So of the 3 approved drugs, there's actually nobody advertising in the marketplace. There's nobody actively promoting a drug. There may be other advertisements for drugs that have symptoms that sound similar to fibromyalgia, which is part of the challenge with getting a patient from their initial conversation with their doc to their diagnosis, because this is a pretty broad symptom group. But in fact, there's nobody actually promoting a fibromyalgia treatment candidate here in the U.S. that we can speak of. I will note there's been a couple of updates in the category. Tonix, which was developing, continues to develop cyclobenzaprine for a number of different disorders, had some encouraging results in their 3rd fibromyalgia trial. Their first 2 failed. The 3rd one was successful. They've just announced that they're no longer continuing their current phase 3 program. They actually did a futility analysis, to the best of our knowledge, and have concluded that the drug probably will not work, so they're not enrolling any new patients in the existing phase 3 trial. So bad news for patients, because there is room for many drugs in this particular category, but suffice it to say the one drug that was significantly ahead of us is actually terminated or put their program on hold at this point. So there is very significant opportunity for a new therapy, and as I mentioned before, IMC-1, we hope, is that therapy. This phase 2B program, which is really a phase 3 program, hopefully will put us in the pole position to get out there and get into a primary market-leading position, presuming continued development and commercialization success. Hopefully that answers your question, Shelley. Okay, well, I've refreshed the Q&A section, and I don't believe there's any more questions here online. We're at the end of the half hour, so I want to thank you for your time and attention in learning more about Virios Therapeutics. Should you have additional questions or want to do additional diligence on the program, please visit our Virios.com website, and you can also leave questions in our investor tab, and we'll be happy to get back to you with any of those specific answers to those questions as time progresses. So with that summary, I wish you all a great day, and thank you for your time and attention. I'll turn it back over to our moderator. Thank you.
Thank you for joining the presentation. You may now disconnect.